Hello and welcome to Deviance and Social Control. I'm Danielle McCartney, and today we're going to talk about social learning theories, or how we learn to be deviant. Let's jump in.
Learning theories argue that we learn how to be deviant and the rationale for why to be deviant, why it's okay, from important people in our life. And as we'll talk, these theories do primarily focus on interpersonal communication, on learning from people in particular. But there has been some development. We do learn from other areas, but it's important to ask yourself how much you learn from watching a video or reading a book or watching a movie compared to someone who's important to you teaching you something, particularly when we're talking about whether or not we're going to follow the rules. So, we're going to talk about three primary theories in this learning theory realm. The first is differential association theory, then social learning theory, and then techniques of neutralization, which isn't exactly a theory, but it's a set of actions that rationalize when we have or are about to engage in deviant or criminal behavior. So up first, differential association theory by Sutherland and Cressy. So differential association theory is a learning theory which focuses on the processes by which individuals come to commit criminal acts. And Sutherland and Cressy really did focus on criminal behavior, but we can broaden this to think about deviant behavior also. So behavior that is outside of the norm, but is not outright illegal. Sutherland and Cressy made 9 propositions about how criminal or deviant behavior is learned. I'm going to focus on the first 7 propositions, because the last 2 don't really help us to understand this concept of learning theories very much. They're overly broad, and they aren't used very much in later formulations of differential association theory. So let's start first with proposition 1. Criminal behavior is learned. So this suggests that deviant or criminal behavior is learned and not inherited or the result of some biological trait. So Sutherland and Cressy were actually working against a lot of people who believed that criminals or deviants were biologically, genetically, physiologically different from normals, from those of us who aren't criminal or deviant. So a large history of criminological research had been focusing on finding biological markers that indicated if someone would be or was criminal or not, physiological differences in body shape, cranial shape, focusing on genetic differences between criminals and non-criminals. And so what Sutherland and Cressy were really suggesting is that it's not about the biology, that it is about the socialization. Now, today, people actually combine these. So even people that are committed to biological predictors of crime don't argue that that behavior is necessarily inherited, but that gives people predispositions to engage in some behaviors. So the idea is that we have biological or genetic predispositions to certain behaviors or actions, but then they have to be enacted or triggered in a particular social environment, in a particular social context. So that's where Sutherland and Cressy were when they were arguing that criminal behavior is learned. And an example of this is a paper by Howard Becker called Becoming a Marijuana User. In this paper, he had interviewed 50 marijuana users, and he argued that an individual will be able to use marijuana for pleasure only when they have learned to smoke it in a way that will produce real effects. So actually smoke it in a way to get high, and then learn to recognize that those effects of getting high are connected to the drug use, and then to interpret those effects, the physiological responses of getting high, as pleasurable. So the idea is people can use the drug, but they may not use it correctly. So somebody has to teach them how to use the drug. Then they have to understand what they are feeling as the result of the drug. And then they have to understand that that feeling is a good feeling. It's a pleasurable feeling. So if you can imagine taking a drug, it can be disorienting. Lots of involuntary responses and feelings might rush up. It's helpful to have somebody who can explain that this is a good thing, that you're doing it right, that this is a good feeling that you're having. So Becker argued that this was sort of the process. Now, maybe you're thinking marijuana, that doesn't even make sense. Why would we have this whole process about becoming a marijuana user? And if that's what your deal is, then think about something harder. Think about some other drugs and the process of learning how to use the drug and then learning to appreciate the effects of the drug and find it pleasurable. So in addition to that process of using the drug, perceiving its effect, and enjoying the effect, you also have to be able to access a supply of the drug. So if I were to ask you right now, you wanted to be a drug user, would you know, without any guidance from anyone else, how to get your hands on some kind of narcotic? You need somebody to show you, to tell you where to get it, to tell you how to get it, to give you a supply of that drug. And because of that, because we're talking about illegal drugs, so maybe not marijuana, in this case, maybe we're talking about something else since marijuana is legal in several states, talking about some other illegal drug, there's often a real need to maintain secrecy, that you know you're doing something wrong, something illegal, and you're trying to hide that. And Becker argued that we try to neutralize the stigma of being associated with a drug culture or being negatively labeled as a drug user by identifying with that subculture. So the process is that we learn about the drug and how to use it. We're socialized into learning about the drug and finding it pleasurable. Then we attach that to a subculture and we build our own identity as related to that subculture. And that helps to kind of neutralize the stigma of being labeled as a drug user. So that whole process is learned. That's part of this differential association process, that criminal behavior in that context is learned. Okay, so proposition number 2. Criminal behavior is learned in interaction with other persons in the process of communication. So remember when I said Sutherland and Cressy were really focused on interpersonal communication. That's this proposition 2, that it's really about interaction and it's about teaching and learning in this process of communication. So let's come back to this one. Let's move on to proposition 3, which says the principal part of the learning of criminal behavior occurs within intimate personal groups. So both the second and third propositions suggest that we learn deviance and deviant behavior from other people, particularly intimate others, particularly people that are important to us. So our family and our friends. Remember that Sutherland was writing during a time when people were not bombarded with mass media and social media and all kinds of information. So more contemporary researchers have moved beyond the intimate others to examine other sources of deviance. But even with that, so even arguing that, yes, people can learn from the media, much of our learning takes place between parents and children, or between friends and acquaintances, between extended family members, or even within our neighborhood. So much of the research suggests that very early deviant behaviors are group activities. So things like underage drinking, or smoking pot, or using other drugs, vandalism, bullying, so on and so forth. They're often done in groups rather than in isolation. And this is especially true among adolescents and young adults. So let's move on to proposition 4. When criminal behavior is learned, the learning includes techniques of committing the crime. And sometimes these techniques are very complicated, but sometimes it's a very simple process of learning the technique. And they learn the specific direction of motives, drives, rationalizations, and attitudes. So this proposition suggests that there's 2 things that need to be learned. First, we have to learn how to engage in the deviant behavior. It could be something very simple. If you wanted to engage in vandalism, you could throw a rock at the window, and that's not necessarily requiring a whole lot of skill. But if you wanted to pick a lock, picking a lock is a very complicated process. And it would be very helpful to learn that from someone. I don't know if you've ever tried looking up how to pick a lock on YouTube. There are videos that can show you how to do that. It's still very difficult, even if you watch the video. It's very helpful if someone can help you, guide you through learning how to pick a lock, for example. But once we know how, we also need to know why. Why would people engage in this behavior in the first place? And that's where Sutherland believed that people needed to learn the motivation, the drive, and the rationalizations to justify making it okay, learning the appropriate attitudes for engaging in deviant behavior. For example, underage drinking is illegal, and there's ad campaigns about not buying alcohol or giving alcohol to people under the age of majority. Parents warn children about not drinking alcohol. Teachers warn children about not drinking alcohol. And yet, many, many people drink alcohol under the age of majority. There must be some other source of information that motivates people to, for example, start drinking. So let's move on to Proposition 5. The specific direction of motives and drives is learned from definitions of the legal codes as favorable or unfavorable. So what does that mean? This means that as we're learning the motivation and as we're learning the drive to engage in deviant or criminal behavior, we have to learn that the legal codes or the social norms of society are either favorable, good for us, we like them, or unfavorable, don't apply to us, we don't like them, they're unfair. We have to learn that where we stand relative to the law, relative to social norms. That's part of this learning process, learning the definitions, how we define the law or we define the social norm as something that we want to follow or something that we don't want to follow. So that leads to Proposition 6. A person becomes delinquent or deviant because of an excess of definitions favorable to violation of law over definitions unfavorable to violation of law. So that means that we get a whole lot of rationalization, we get a whole lot of reasons that mean that it's okay to violate the law, that the law doesn't mean anything. So an example is driving too fast on the freeway. Most people exceed the speed limit on the freeway. And you ask somebody why they drive too fast on the freeway, they will have a number of reasons why it's okay. Oh, that speed limit doesn't really matter. Nobody's getting hurt by this. The law is wrong. We don't need to stay under the speed limit. It's no big deal. Everybody else is doing it. So we have a whole long list of why it's okay to violate that law. And the same thing might be true for underage drinking. So we'll go back to that example. If there are a bunch of people in our life that say, well, it's not that big of a deal, it doesn't matter, no big deal. Those are definitions that are favorable to violations of the law. On the other hand, if we grew up in a family or if we're surrounded by peers that say, this law is really important, this is something that you should do, you should not violate this law, then we're going to be less likely to engage in that behavior. So the last one that I'm going to talk about is that differential associations may vary in, actually, one quick point. When Sutherland and Cressy were talking about this, they're talking about differential association in terms of exposure to those definitions that are favorable to the violation of law. So frequency. So frequency is how often we are exposed. If there are important people in our lives that consistently, frequently expose us to these definitions that are favorable to violating social norms or violating the law, we're going to be more likely to engage in behavior that violates the law or violates those social norms. So how frequent we are exposed to those definitions will increase the likelihood of us engaging in deviant behavior. Also, duration. So that's the length of exposure. So if we are exposed to definitions that are favorable to the violation of law or social norms, we're exposed to those definitions for a long period of time. So that belief is getting reinforced over and over and over over a long period of time, we're going to be more likely to adopt those same attitudes and behaviors and break the law or break social norms. Then also priority. So how early on in life one is exposed to those definitions that are favorable to the violation of law or social norms. So if we're exposed to attitudes and beliefs, definitions that say it's okay to break the law or it's okay to violate this norm at a very young age, it's going to make a big impact on us. When we're exposed as children to something, we're going to be more likely to adopt that as adults. So if we're exposed as children about being favorable to violating the law, we'll be more likely to violate the law as we get older. And then intensity. So this is about the level of respect or admiration we hold for the person who is providing those definitions. So if we really admire or respect somebody and they tell us it is okay to break the law, we're going to be more likely to listen to them. If there's somebody that we don't respect, somebody we don't admire that says we're supposed to break the law, we're going to be less likely to break the law. So if we are exposed to somebody who's important to us that says it's okay to break the law or break this social norm, we're going to be more likely to break that social norm. Okay, let's move on to Aker's social learning theory. So Robert Burgess and Ronald Aker argued that Sutherland's differential association theory lacked an explanation of the mechanisms by which deviant behavior is learned. So they were really arguing that this is an expansion and an adaptation of differential association, not a whole new theory. And they introduced the psychological concept of operant conditioning to the theory. The notion behind operant conditioning is that learning is enhanced by both social and non-social reinforcement, that criminal or deviant behavior is learned when the positive consequences of deviant behavior are more powerful than the positive consequences of normative behavior. Aker's theory of social learning poses the question of how criminal behavior is learned. And the answer to this question is that we learn to be criminal or not to be criminal through punishments and reinforcement. So when we're doing something wrong, we get punished. When we're doing something right, we get reinforced. This kind of system shows us when we're doing what we're supposed to and when we're getting off track. They also noted that the observation of the actions of others and their consequences can also lead to a strengthening of one's own deviant behavior. So if we observe others engaging in deviant behavior and we see what happens to them, and maybe the consequences are minor or they have positive consequences, then we're going to be more likely to engage in behaviors. So if we observe someone getting positive reinforcement or getting praised for engaging in some deviant behavior, then we're going to be more likely to engage in it ourselves. Aker's really just modified the propositions that Sutherland put forward. So Sutherland said that criminal behavior is learned. Burgess and Aker said criminal behavior is learned according to the principles of operant conditioning. Aker put forward 4 main propositions and said that an individual is more likely to commit violations when 1, he or she differentially associates with others who commit, model, and support violations of social and legal norms. So you can see this really supports differential association theory. But then he adds 2, the violative behavior is differentially reinforced over behavior in conformity to the norm. You can see the operant conditioning here because it's about reinforcing conformity to the norm or reinforcing deviance from the norm. 3, he or she is more exposed to and observes more deviant than conforming models. This is also similar to differential association. And then 4 should look familiar. His or her own learned definitions are favorable toward committing the deviant acts. Aker's more recent work focuses on 4 main concepts: definitions, differential association, differential reinforcement, and imitation. So definitions. Definitions are the attitudes, beliefs, and rationalizations that define a behavior as good or bad, right or wrong, appropriate or inappropriate. And definitions can be general or specific. So, for example, a general definition that might endorse, skipping school is the belief that school rules are arbitrary and discriminatory. Alternatively, a more specific definition might be a statement like, if I can get good grades and miss a few classes, why shouldn't I skip a few classes? And then differential association. So definitions are important, but where do they come from? Like Sutherland, Akers argues that definitions are learned from differential association with important people or in important interactions. Early on, those kinds of contacts are with family, with parents, siblings, maybe cousins, maybe children of parental friends. And then later, children meet other peers on their own in the neighborhood and in school. And eventually, people get jobs or find romantic relationships, have new social networks. And in each stage, new and different sorts of definitions and behaviors are modeled and encouraged. Then Akers focused on differential reinforcement. So differential reinforcement is clearly a concept that Akers adds to Sutherland's original theory. The concept refers to the balance of anticipated and actual rewards and punishments that follow, or the consequences of behaviors. Sutherland wrote a great deal about exposures to definitions, but did not say very much about how behavioral patterns are actually learned. Akers argues that to the extent it is likely that behaviors will be rewarded or punished, and frequently and in terms of quantity, rewards and punishments will reinforce or diminish the behavior, respectively. So if we get reinforcement of our behavior, we're going to be more likely to do it. If we get more rewards to engage in a behavior than we get punishments, then we're going to be more likely to do it. If we start getting more and more punishments, then we should stop doing that behavior. We'll engage in some kind of different behavior. The fourth is imitation. And imitation is really just observing modeled behaviors. Maybe you've seen children imitating smoking a cigarette with like a stick or a straw. And there even used to be candy cigarettes once upon a time. This allows children to imitate adult smokers. So, whether candy cigarettes promote smoking or whether modeling is a strong predictor of anything is still debated, but clearly, imitation is a part of learning, and that's one of the ways that we learn how to do things, by imitating others doing whatever it is that we find attractive. So next, let's talk about Sykes and Matza's techniques of neutralization. This is really a clarification of one of Sutherland's major points. The fact is that young people drift in and out of delinquency, and all of us do. Sometimes we engage in deviant behavior, and sometimes we don't. By studying juveniles and talking to juveniles, Sykes and Matza observed that they feel a sense of guilt, that juveniles often respect and admire law-abiding adults. The delinquents knew the behavior was wrong, but they still engaged in deviant or criminal behavior. So why do people break the laws they believe in? Think about the last time you did something that you knew was not cool and you did it anyway. Why? Why did you do it anyway? Sykes and Matza went over several techniques that, one, protects us from self-blame so that we can kind of get off the hook. We can be free of guilt. These techniques protect our self-image, but also opens the door to even more kind of deviant or criminal behavior. First up is the denial of responsibility. This technique is used by individuals to argue that they are not responsible for their behavior. Some of this might be an argument that their behavior was a mistake or an accident, but Sykes and Matza argue that the denial of responsibility goes well beyond just the claim that it was an accident. This technique is essentially used to suggest that the individual is somehow compelled by forces beyond their control. The individual is helplessly propelled into bad behavior by unloving parents, a bad teacher, a boss, or a bad neighborhood. In general, denial of responsibility is that whatever happened was caused by forces outside of that individual's control. So the phrase that goes along with this is, I didn't mean it. It was not my responsibility. The second technique, the denial of injury, focuses on whether the deviance is perceived to cause injury or harm to anyone. It might be symbolized by the statement, but nobody was hurt by it. It's probable that this technique is used frequently in the justification for a lot of deviant behavior, since a lot of deviant behavior is defined as not harmful enough to go against the laws. In these instances, when the behavior may go against understood social norms, but not be very harmful to others, it's easy for individuals to argue that their behavior should be allowed and is not really all that bad because it isn't hurting anyone. So the denial of injury is like, nobody's really hurt by this behavior, so it's okay that I engage in it. Nobody was really hurt. The third is the denial of the victim. So this is kind of an extension of the denial of injury. It's the rationalization that while a victim might exist and somebody got hurt, that person deserved the harm or they brought it on themselves. This technique of neutralization focuses on the fact that the victim deserves to be harmed because it's retaliation or it's punishment for some slight that the victim has perpetrated on the deviant. This behavior becomes justified, just like Robin Hood's behavior of stealing from the rich to give to the poor was justified, but maybe against the rules to steal, but the rich brought it on themselves by stealing from the poor first. The denial of the victim agrees that deviant action was taken and somebody was hurt, but the injury was not wrong. They had it coming to them. And then the fourth technique is the condemnation of the condemners. This technique shifts the focus or the blame to the individuals who are pointing the finger at the deviant's behavior. It's a diversionary tactic used to point out that others' behavior is also deviant, and therefore those condemners have no right to call into question the behavior of the deviant individual. So as with all diversionary tactics, the goal of this one is not to have a meaningful conversation, really, about anyone's deviance, but to deflect attention from the original assertion and then help the deviant slip from view. This condemnation of the condemners really shifts the focus to those doing the condemning. Everybody's picking on me and other people are hypocrites. Other people are doing bad things too. Somebody who steals from a department store could say, well, the department store is ripping people off with their high prices, so my stealing isn't any worse than this corporation that's stealing from people with their high prices, for example. And then the fifth one is the final technique is the appeal to higher loyalties. This technique of neutralization is one where the wishes of the larger group, like society, lose out to the wishes of a smaller and more intimate group. In other words, when an individual sees themselves as loyal to a group and that group demands the behavior that violates the rules of societies, then that person could argue that loyalty requires breaking the rules for the good of the small group. In this instance, the individual may not see themselves as caught between the two groups. For example, somebody should know that they're not supposed to fight with somebody else, but they may do it to protect their younger brother or because their friends demanded it to show loyalty to the group. This appeal to higher loyalties is really about a competing set of rules to follow. And the rationale here is I didn't do it for myself. I did it because I was being loyal to the group. I was protecting someone. I was showing my affinity with the group. I was showing my loyalty. And all five of these techniques of rationalization, these techniques of neutralization, are there to allow us to not take the blame. So it protects us from the kind of guilt that we have when we know we're doing something that we're not supposed to be doing. This really fits into learning theory. So not only do we have to learn how to engage in criminal or deviant behavior, learn why to engage in criminal behavior, but we also need to figure out a way to rationalize it to ourselves, to make it okay. And that's what these techniques of neutralization do.
That's it. Hope you learned a lot. I'll see you next time.